The room was a study in polished authority. The walls of Clarence House shimmered under the muted glow of antique sconces, each flicker revealing the steady rows of portraits, queens, consorts, and statesmen whose eyes seemed to track the movement of every living soul within these halls. Yet, despite the historical weight that surrounded them, the present carried its own urgency. Advisors shuffled papers. Legal officers whispered beneath breath. Communication staff tapped quietly at keyboards, eyes darting between screens displaying breaking headlines and internal briefings. Every gesture adhered to centuries of protocol, but there was a tautness, an invisible thread stretched to its limit. Then, the door opened without ceremony. Prince William stepped inside. No knock, no announcement, only the soft, deliberate echo of polished shoes on marble. He paused at the threshold, eyes scanning the room with an intensity that silence murmurs mid-sentence. A hush fell, a suspended moment that neither demanded attention nor tolerated hesitation. He carried himself with the composure expected of an heir apparent. Yet there was an edge, subtle and sharp, in the set of his jaw and the quick flicker in his gaze. Gentlemen, ladies. His voice was steady, almost measured, but it carried weight that instantly redirected focus. We have a situation. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Advisors froze mid-gesture. A legal officer's hand hovered over a stack of documents, eyes widening. The calm surface of the room cracked, revealing the urgent undercurrent that had, until now, remained invisible. It was a royal protection officer who spoke next, the quiet professional whose duty was absolute. Sir, during the routine sweep of the Queen Consort's private quarters, a concealed recording device was found inside Her Majesty's handbag. The room did not just pause. It collectively inhaled. The notion was almost unthinkable. Security was absolute. Trust, foundational. Yet here it was, protocol violated, the private made public by circumstance alone. William did not react with overt emotion. There was no shout, no accusation, no tremor of disbelief. Instead, he moved closer to the central table, eyes narrowing slightly as he processed every nuance. The type of device, its placement, the potential scope of what might have been recorded. His mind traced possibilities with the precision of someone trained to anticipate threat. Yet the moral calculus was infinitely more complex. For a moment, time stretched. The camera drifts through the room, capturing the subtle tremor of a junior aide's hand, the rigid posture of seasoned security officers, and the frozen countenances of communications advisors who realized their every word in the last 72 hours could now be scrutinized. "The device," William began, voice lowered almost to a murmur, yet carrying enough clarity that every ear caught the weight of each syllable, "was active. It has been recording." A shiver moved through the room, imperceptible yet palpable. 2 private strategy meetings, sensitive discussions concerning public engagements, diplomatic correspondences, all potentially compromised. Eyes shifted toward Camilla. She sat poised, her composure intact, yet the faintest crease at the corner of her brow betrayed recognition. The implications were immediate, personal, and unignorable. Was this discovered before or after the meetings? One senior aide finally managed, voice tight with controlled panic. Before the second session concluded, the officer replied, "We intercepted it in time, Your Royal Highness, but the recordings exist." William's gaze moved slowly around the room, assessing, calculating. Each face told its own story. Shock, concern, fear, or guilt. Yet underneath, he sensed something deeper, a fracture between duty and trust. A silent question hovered, heavy and unavoidable. Could this breach have been intentional? He straightened, placing both hands on the table. The sound of his palms on polished oak was a punctuation mark, a reminder of authority, of responsibility. We are to assume nothing. Protocol remains absolute. Immediate containment. Internal lockdown. No movement beyond essential duty. The room responded, nearly in unison, like a single organism reacting to a predator's presence. Staff nodded. Hands moved efficiently, yet each gesture carried the weight of unease. Security doors engaged automatically. Electronic locks clicked in soft but final assertion. Outside, the corridors emptied quietly, footfalls retreating into the palace's stone arteries. Yet even as procedures unfolded, William's mind moved faster than the room itself. Every angle, every variable, was calculated against centuries of precedent. He considered every scenario, internal manipulation, inadvertent error, political leverage, but also the most unthinkable possibility, betrayal from within. Camilla remained seated, dignified, her eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the immediate chaos. She did not speak, yet her silence was eloquent. It was the composure of someone who had endured relentless scrutiny, who understood that appearance and reality were often worlds apart in a palace environment. Her silence forced the room to confront the raw moral dimension of what had occurred. It was not just a breach of security. It was a breach of trust. William's voice, when it came again, was softer, contemplative yet resolute. This is no longer just a procedural concern. Every movement, every access point in the last 72 hours will be accounted for. And yet, we proceed with dignity. The crown is above spectacle. We act quietly, decisively, without exposure beyond necessity. A junior officer hesitated, then handed him a small tablet, displaying logs of access permissions and unusual entries. William studied them, noting an unscheduled exchange, a subtle reassignment within security detail, and the timing of the handbag's placement. The patterns were almost imperceptible, yet deliberate enough to warrant scrutiny. Hours seemed to pass in the span of minutes. William moved deliberately, consulting quietly with the Royal Protection Officer, cross-referencing movement logs with recorded events. The room, while outwardly composed, hummed with suppressed tension. Conversations were clipped, eyes darted to Prince, as though seeking permission for every word, every gesture. And then came the realization. This device, the seemingly innocuous instrument, was capable not only of observation, but of influence. It could shift perceptions, manipulate decisions, shape the narrative of the monarchy itself. The moral weight of the situation pressed against him like the stone walls surrounding the palace. Camilla finally spoke, her voice measured, calm, yet carrying a quiet strength. "We do not yet know the intention," she said, "but we must assume it is not trivial." William nodded, recognizing the gravity of her insight. He allowed a moment of silence, a breath in which the palace itself seemed to exhale. The chandeliers above reflected light across the room, fragmented into patterns that danced across ancient carpets, like time itself fracturing under scrutiny. Orders were issued, steps were taken, and the first layer of immediate threat was contained. Yet beneath it, an undercurrent of questions remained. Who placed the device? Why? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how close had it come to shaping decisions before discovery? The prince's gaze lingered on Camilla, then swept the room once more. He understood that the crisis had only begun. Trust, once fractured, would demand vigilance. Protocol would be tested against loyalty. And somewhere beyond the visible corridors, in spaces no one could easily monitor, the true origin of the device awaited revelation. The camera drifts backward as the room resumes its disciplined motion. Papers shuffled, security measures enacted, whispered directives exchanged. Yet in the silence between actions, in the measured breathing of those present, one truth remained undeniable. The monarchy's integrity had been challenged quietly from within. And Prince William, bound by duty and conscience, would see this through, without panic, without accusation, but with the full weight of responsibility pressing against every decision. The corridors of Clarence House had returned to relative calm, yet the atmosphere was heavy with a kind of anticipatory dread. The echo of footsteps had faded, replaced by the soft hum of security systems and the quiet rustle of documents being scrutinized. Shadows clung to the corners of rooms lined with portraits of monarchs past, their painted eyes observing in silence, as if aware that the present moment would become history. Prince William moved methodically through the halls, the weight of responsibility visible in his measured steps. The discovery of the recording device had set in motion a series of actions dictated not only by security protocol, but by centuries of tradition. Each rule intertwined with precedent, discretion, and moral duty. The Lord Chamberlain's office had assumed oversight, formally activating a classified internal inquiry under Royalty Protection Command, known as SO-14. Within the secure forensic lab, technicians worked with precise, almost ritualistic focus. The device itself rested beneath a clear, tamper-proof dome, its small metallic body almost innocuous, yet its potential for intrusion was vast. Signals were logged, activation frequencies charted, timestamps meticulously cross-referenced with staff schedules. Cameras above recorded every movement, ensuring that the investigation itself was beyond reproach. William observed silently, standing slightly apart, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes narrowing as he absorbed every detail. Every flicker of a monitor, every gesture of a technician, carried significance. He understood that diligence alone would not reveal the truth. Intuition, experience, and knowledge of palace patterns would be equally crucial. For 3 hours, they reconstructed movements across the previous 72 hours. Sworn officers traced minor deviations, an unscheduled handbag exchange in the Queen Consort's private suite, a brief reassignment within the security team, a single unlocked door at an unusual hour. Each anomaly seemed minor in isolation, yet collectively, they formed a mosaic of questions that could not be ignored. "Sir," one officer said quietly, voice careful, "the device appears to have recorded 2 full strategy sessions. Both were strictly confidential. There is no external transmission detected so far, but we cannot yet rule out prior access." William's gaze shifted to the monitor, showing security logs. Every entry, every badge scan, every unlocked door now carried layers of meaning. He understood the stakes, not just security, but the integrity of every discussion, every decision made behind these walls. Meanwhile, the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. The ancient tapestries absorbed sound, the velvet curtains muted footsteps. Even the air felt charged, as though history itself had taken note of the breach. Staff moved efficiently, but there was an unmistakable tension beneath each motion. The silent fear of consequence, the weight of potential betrayal. Camilla was present, though at a discreet distance. Her composure was unwavering, but William noted the subtle adjustments in her posture. The crossing of legs, the quiet clasping of hands, gestures learned over decades of scrutiny. She did not speak, but her presence underscored the personal dimension of the investigation. This was not merely an institutional failure. It was intimate, threatening the very trust that bound the household. Hours passed in quiet analysis. Forensic specialists dissected the device layer by layer. Microchips, circuit boards, a miniature microphone capable of capturing sound with startling clarity. Metadata revealed installation time, activation sequences, and minor fluctuations suggesting deliberate concealment. Each revelation added precision to the outline of what had occurred, yet the human question remained. Who had orchestrated it and why? William moved from room to room, observing the reconstruction of staff movements. In one office, a junior aide quietly explained the temporary reassignment he had implemented, unaware of how a seemingly small adjustment might intersect with the breach. In another, senior security officers debated access permissions, weighing procedural compliance against trust in personnel with decades of service. The timing, one officer noted, voice low, suggests this was not opportunistic. Whoever placed the device knew exactly when to act and when to avoid detection. William's eyes lingered on the faces around him. He recognized a faint, unspoken fear, the recognition that every interaction, every gesture in the past 3 days could now carry unintended significance. And yet, he also saw professionalism, a steadfast adherence to duty despite the uncertainty. It was a delicate balance, vigilance without panic, observation without assumption. In the quieter corners of the palace, he paused before a portrait of Queen Victoria. Her gaze, stern and commanding, seemed to reflect a burden of continuity, the expectation that each generation uphold not only ceremonial dignity, but also the invisible structures of trust, secrecy, and morality. William felt the weight of that lineage acutely. The breach was not merely a technical problem. It was a moral challenge, testing the very fabric of loyalty within the palace walls. Forensic results began to yield more alarming revelations. The device had captured full audio from private discussions, sensitive matters concerning succession, public messaging, and internal advisory deliberations. Whoever had installed it had intended more than passive observation. They had sought influence, insight, and potentially leverage. The moral implications were profound. The monarchy itself could be shaped, subtly or overtly, by forces operating from within. A subtle ripple passed through the security team as they correlated access logs with the timeline of the recordings. One pattern emerged. The device had been placed during a private gathering inside the palace. Inside a moment assumed safe, shielded from external scrutiny. The realization reframed the crisis entirely. It was no longer only a matter of institutional procedure. It was a test of familial cohesion, a probe into the very dynamics of trust between household members. Camilla approached William quietly, her voice measured, formal. "We cannot assume malice where error may exist, but the intent cannot be ignored," she said. "Even a small breach carries consequences beyond immediate perception." William nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. In his mind, he weighed the consequences of exposure, the danger of rumor, and the delicate necessity of discretion. The inquiry would proceed, unrelenting yet contained. Every officer, every aide would be accounted for. And yet, the question persisted. If this breach was deliberate, how far had it been planned? And how close had it come to altering decisions, shaping outcomes, and influencing perception of the monarchy itself? As the afternoon waned, he returned to the device. The metallic surface, so small and unassuming, now symbolized a far-reaching threat. It had crossed the boundary between observation and intrusion, between knowledge and manipulation, and had been placed by someone who understood not just the mechanics of security, but the subtler machinery of loyalty, influence, and authority. The palace itself seemed to respond to this realization. Corridors that had once echoed with routine now carried only measured steps. Rooms that had been alive with discussion were now hushed, as if the walls themselves acknowledged the delicate balance between duty and betrayal. The portraits, the tapestries, even the velvet curtains seemed to hold their breath, watching as the investigation unfolded. By evening, a preliminary report had been compiled. The device's recordings were intact. The timeline of access was reconstructed. Staff movements meticulously cross-checked. And yet, for all the clarity gained, the moral question loomed larger than ever. Someone had intended more than mere observation. They had intended to shape the future of the crown. William's reflection was quiet, internal, but no less precise. The monarchy required vigilance not only against external threats, but against subtle, internal erosion. Trust was fragile. Loyalty was tested not only in crisis, but in the unseen, measured decisions of every day. And in this silent, methodical inquiry, the heir apparent understood that the next steps could determine not only the outcome of this breach, but the precedent for all breaches to come. The forensic confirmation lingered in the air long after the report was delivered. 2 private strategy sessions, recorded in full, not partially, not distorted, preserved. The palace corridors felt narrower now. Outside, the winter light filtered through tall windows and pale ribbons, touching marble floors that had borne centuries of footsteps. Inside, silence settled like a second architecture, thick, structural, immovable. The institution had absorbed shocks before. Scandal, war, abdication. But this was different. This was intimate. Prince William stood at the head of the long council table in a private chamber governed by the oldest confidentiality protocols in royal service. The room itself seemed designed to contain gravity. No press access. No electronic devices. Curtains drawn. A single guarded entrance. Present were only those whose positions made them unavoidable. The Lord Chamberlain, Senior Legal Counsel, the head of Royal Protection Command, and Camilla. No one spoke at first. It was not fear that held the room. It was calculation. William broke the silence with deliberate calm. The device did not transmit externally. He began, voice steady, unhurried. But it was placed with knowledge of our internal rhythms. That narrows the field. The Lord Chamberlain inclined his head. "We have cross-referenced access permissions, Your Royal Highness." One anomaly intersects with both recorded sessions. A tablet slid silently across polished oak. William did not sit. He read standing. A name, not a foreign operative, not an external contractor, a domestic communications consultant, recently dismissed under quiet circumstances 6 weeks earlier. The air shifted. This was no longer espionage in the traditional sense. It was proximity. Camilla's expression did not change, yet something subtle moved behind her eyes. Recognition. History. She spoke with measured clarity. He was not dismissed for incompetence. William looked up. No, she continued. He was dismissed for influence. The word landed carefully. Influence, not disloyalty, not misconduct. Influence. The consultant, trusted once to shape public messaging, to navigate fragile narratives, to position the monarchy within modern discourse, had overstepped advisory boundaries. Recommendations had blurred into strategic pressure. Suggestions had edged toward direction. He had wanted proximity to decision-making power. And when that proximity ended, so did his access, or so they believed. Metadata places his encrypted signature within the device's firmware configuration. The security chief said quietly, "It's subtle, but it's there. Not direct installation, not physical evidence, but design." William absorbed the implications. This was not a reckless act. It was meticulous, designed by someone who understood communications infrastructure, security gaps, and, most crucially, the psychology of institutional reaction. Whoever planted the device knew that discovery would provoke internal scrutiny, knew that suspicion would ripple outward. The monarchy was not merely a family. It was a structure built on perception. And perception, once destabilized, rarely reassembled cleanly. "Where is he now?" William asked. "London, consulting privately. No direct palace contact since dismissal." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Camilla folded her hands gently in her lap. "This was not about listening," she said. "It was about leverage." Her voice held no tremor, only clarity. William understood. If the recordings contained deliberations about succession optics, internal advisory disagreements, or strategy disagreements, even partial disclosure could distort narratives, fracture alliances, reignite dormant tensions. The device was a pressure point, not explosive, but surgical. A legal advisor cleared his throat softly. "Your Royal Highness." Public exposure would be catastrophic, not because of content, but because of breach. Trust and internal security would erode overnight. William's gaze moved from face to face. Each individual here had dedicated decades to service, to continuity, to discretion. Yet beneath the institutional calm, he sensed something more fragile. Old tensions, long-standing philosophical differences about modernization, transparency, advisory power. The consultant had thrived in those fractures. He had positioned himself as a translator between tradition and media age ambition, and perhaps he had grown impatient. Was anyone aware of ongoing communication after dismissal? William asked. A pause, a subtle shift of posture from one senior advisor. Not guilt, but discomfort. There were informal exchanges. The advisor admitted carefully. Professional courtesies. Nothing strategic. William held his gaze. "Informal," he repeated quietly. The word echoed. Informality had no place in side protocol, and yet human relationships inevitably complicated structure. Hours later, the council session intensified. Historical precedents were referenced. Confidentiality statutes reviewed. The boundaries of internal prosecution debated. Camilla remained composed, but William noticed her breathing deepen when succession briefing files were mentioned. The recordings had captured a discussion about future positioning, not current governance, but perception management. The consultant had once argued aggressively for narrative reshaping, for recalibration of public sympathy metrics, for accelerated generational visibility. He had believed urgency was strength. The monarchy believed patience was. Now, metadata from the device revealed access timestamps intersecting with encrypted succession drafts. Not stolen, not extracted, but referenced. Someone had access summaries that only a narrow circle should have seen. Authority in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Trust became conditional. William leaned forward, palms resting lightly on the table. "This institution does not fracture because of disagreement," he said. "It fractures when disagreement becomes manipulation." No one responded, because no one disagreed. The security chief introduced a new detail. The physical placement of the device had required access during a private family gathering inside palace grounds, not during a public engagement, not during an event with external staff. Inside, Within familiarity, the moral dimension sharpened. Someone within the orbit, perhaps unknowingly, had enabled proximity. Camilla finally allowed a flicker of visible emotion, not fear, disappointment. "We speak of loyalty as though it is ceremonial," she said quietly. "It is not. It is discipline." William felt the weight of that statement. He knew the public imagined power as privilege, but within these walls, power was restraint, and restraint required trust. The consultant's motive began to crystallize. Dismissed, marginalized, convinced that the institution was resistant to necessary evolution. Recording internal discussions would provide leverage, either to reassert relevance or to position himself externally as an informed voice should conflict arise. It was ambition dressed as correction, but ambition, when detached from duty, becomes corrosive. By late evening, William requested a private conversation with Camilla. They stood in a smaller drawing room, firelight casting soft amber across velvet furnishings. For the first time since discovery, the room felt human rather than procedural. "Do you believe he intended harm?" William asked. Camilla considered. "I believe he intended influence," she replied. "And influence, when denied legitimacy, seeks alternative routes." William nodded slowly. The monarchy's greatest vulnerability was not attack. It was erosion, gradual, intellectual, strategic, a narrative subtly reshaped, a disagreement amplified. Exposure would validate him. Camilla continued. Silence may neutralize him. William understood the paradox. To prosecute publicly would invite spectacle. To suppress entirely risk precedent. Leadership demanded choosing the least destabilizing truth. Meanwhile, security teams expanded their inquiry. Financial audits, communication cross-referencing, discreet surveillance approvals under legal authority. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just steady pressure. By midnight, confirmation arrived. The consultant had accessed archival briefing materials through a secondary channel, facilitated unintentionally by a junior aide who believed he was retrieving outdated drafts for archival formatting. The aide had no knowledge of the device, no awareness of misuse, just procedural obedience. The revelation shifted the moral center again. The breach was deliberate at its origin, but enabled by innocence. William returned to the council chamber alone. The long table, now empty, reflected dim overhead light. He placed both hands on its surface. This was a line between loyalty and power, between modernization and manipulation, between necessary evolution and destabilizing ambition. The monarchy did not fear adaptation. It feared corrosion. And corrosion begins quietly. He understood now that confronting the consultant publicly could fracture internal morale. Some staff had admired him. Others had resisted him. The debate over communication strategy had been genuine. But recording private deliberation crossed a boundary older than any living royal. It violated the sacred trust of closed council. The next morning, under ancient confidentiality statutes, William authorized a controlled summons. Not arrest, no spectacle, a private inquiry, no press, no public acknowledgement. The consultant will be confronted with evidence, calmly, precisely, and then given a choice. Discretion in exchange for permanent exclusion, or legal escalation under breach of trust statutes. The monarchy would not be manipulated, but neither would it indulge theatrical retaliation. As dawn light spilled across Palace Stone, William stood at a window overlooking the courtyard. Guards rotated shifts below with disciplined precision. Boots on gravel, measured cadence, continuity. Inside, uncertainty still pulsed. Trust had been strained, but not shattered. Not yet. He knew the confrontation would test more than legal authority. It would test moral clarity. Because the consultant had once believed he was serving progress. And perhaps, in his own mind, he still did. But what he had forgotten was this. Influence without consent is intrusion, and power without discipline is threat. William exhaled slowly. The institution would endure, but only if its leaders understood when to expose and when to contain. And as preparations were finalized for a discreet meeting that would determine the consultant's fate, one realization settled heavily within him. The recordings were only part of the equation. The greater danger lay in how close ambition had come to reshaping authority from within. The night had settled heavily over Clarence House, but the weight pressing against Prince William's thoughts was older than the darkness outside. By morning, the consultant would be summoned. By morning, decisions were hardened into consequence. But for now, there was only silence, and the archive room, hidden behind reinforced oak doors and accessible only through layered authorization. The royal archives were less a storage space and more a vault of institutional memory. The air carried the faint scent of aged parchment and polished wood. Rows of index volumes lined the walls. Correspondence, sealed memoranda, strategic advisory notes dating back generations. This was where decisions were remembered. This was where motives were preserved long after faces faded from public memory. William entered alone. The echo of the door closing behind him was softer than expected, yet it felt final. A boundary crossed between present crisis and historical perspective. He moved slowly through the aisles, fingertips grazing leather-bound volumes. The lighting was low but precise, designed to protect fragile ink and aging paper. Every document here had once represented urgency. Now they represented precedent. He located the file series connected to internal communication strategy reforms from the previous decade. It was here that the consultant's name appeared most frequently: advisory notes, strategic outlines, messaging recalibrations. At first glance, nothing improper. Sharp intellect, ambitious proposals, a desire to modernize tone, to accelerate generational positioning, to reshape narrative dynamics around succession. But beneath the language of progress, William detected something else: impatience. In one memo, the consultant had written, "Perception delayed as opportunity surrendered." William closed the file gently. The monarchy did not operate on urgency. It operated on endurance. And impatience inside an institution built on continuity can become destabilizing. He moved to another file, sealed correspondence between senior advisors during early debates about balancing tradition with media transparency. The consultant had argued for selective vulnerability, for controlled disclosures to humanize leadership. Some of the ideas had merit, but merit untethered from restraint becomes strategy without anchor. Hours passed quietly. Outside the archive room, the palace functioned with disciplined calm. Staff movements were minimal. Conversations clipped. The internal inquiry remained classified under the Lord Chamberlain's authority. Yet beneath the velvet calm of hallways and tapestries, tension lingered. Inside the archive room, William found what he had suspected. A briefing note referencing advisory influence over succession optics had been flagged months earlier, not formally reprimanded, but quietly noted as overreach. The consultant had requested access to drafts not yet finalized. Access had been denied, officially, but secondary review logs showed that summaries, non-sensitive excerpts, had been accessed through a junior aide's archival retrieval request. Not stolen, not hacked, requested, and granted under procedural misunderstanding. The breach had not been forced. It had been facilitated by familiarity. William leaned back in the leather chair near the central desk. This was not the portrait of a villain. It was a portrait of someone who believed proximity to power equated to entitlement over it. He closed his eyes briefly. The moral conflict deepened. Punishment would be simple. Understanding was harder. Meanwhile, in her private sitting room, Camilla reflected in solitude. The fire crackled gently, casting long shadows across framed photographs. Moment of ceremony, remembrance, and quiet endurance. Decades of public scrutiny had taught her the difference between criticism and corrosion. This felt like the latter. She understood influence. She understood narrative shaping. For years, public perception had been a battlefield she navigated with patience. But recording private counsel crossed an invisible boundary. It was not disagreement. It was intrusion. Her thoughts drifted to the private family gathering during which the device had been placed. The laughter, the casual ease, the lowering of guard. The realization struck with quiet force. The device had been planted not during tension, but during trust. That detail reframed everything. Back in the archive room, William uncovered one final element. A sealed advisory memo drafted weeks before the consultant's dismissal. It warned of escalating advisory assertiveness and recommended recalibration of access privileges to preserve institutional clarity. The language was diplomatic, but the implication was clear. Lines had blurred. William stood and walked toward a small, secured cabinet containing constitutional guidelines and heritage acts governing internal confidentiality. The statutes were unequivocal. Private counsel within the monarchy was protected under confidentiality frameworks older than modern intelligence law. Violation was not merely professional misconduct. It was institutional breach. And yet, the consultant had not leaked the recordings. Not yet, which meant leverage remained unused. Why? Because leverage is most powerful when unseen. William's mind moved carefully through possibilities. Was the device intended as insurance? As pressure? Or as preparation for a future moment of confrontation? He returned the files to their proper sequence. The archive room did not judge. It recorded, and history often revealed that internal fractures rarely began with malice. They began with conviction, untethered from discipline. By late afternoon, security delivered a discreet update. The junior aide whose archival retrieval facilitated the consultant's indirect access had come forward voluntarily. He had noticed irregular metadata during cross-checking and reported it immediately. There was no evidence of collusion, only naivety. William requested to see him privately. The aide entered stiffly, posture rigid with anxiety. His voice trembled slightly, though his words were precise. "I believe the request was routine, sir. I did not know the summaries would be retained." William studied him carefully. Fear was visible, but not deception. "Did you question the frequency of requests?" William asked. "Yes, sir, but I assumed professional necessity." That assumption, professional necessity, was a crack through which influence had slipped. William dismissed him gently, instructing security to apply institutional clemency under manipulated compliance protocols. The monarchy would not sacrifice innocence to demonstrate strength, but neither would it ignore vulnerability. As evening returned, the palace atmosphere shifted again. The consultant had confirmed attendance for the following morning's private inquiry. No resistance, no hesitation. Confidence. Confidence can be the most revealing signal. William stood once more at the archive room threshold before leaving. He understood now that the crisis was not purely technical, nor purely legal. It was philosophical. What is the boundary between advising power and attempting to shape it? Where does loyalty end and ambition begin? The monarchy's survival had always depended on restraint, measured adaptation, deliberate evolution. But in an age of accelerated narratives and digital immediacy, patience could appear like stagnation. The consultant had likely believed he was correcting inertia. Instead, he had endangered equilibrium. Camilla joined William briefly in the corridor outside the archives. The light was dim, the air still. "History will not remember the device," she said quietly. "It will remember how we responded." William nodded. Response defines legacy more than crisis. He realized then that transparency and protection would have to coexist delicately. The truth would be acknowledged internally. Consequences would be applied. But public spectacle would be denied. Because spectacle feeds influence. Silence starves it. As night deepened once more, preparations for the private inquiry were finalized. Legal frameworks reviewed. Evidence compiled. No raised voices anticipated. No dramatic confrontation planned. Just facts and choice. William returned to his private office and stood alone for several moments. The weight he carried was invisible to the public. They would see routine engagements, polished appearances, ceremonial composure. They would never see the archive room. They would never hear the quiet confession of a junior aide. They would never feel the moral calculus unfolding beneath velvet walls. But leadership is rarely visible at its most consequential. It is exercised in silence. Tomorrow, the consultant would face evidence he believed he had concealed beneath sophistication. Tomorrow, William would draw the line, not with anger, but with clarity. And somewhere between ambition and loyalty, between influence and discipline, the monarchy would reaffirm its oldest truth. Power is not seized within these walls. It is entrusted. The morning arrived without spectacle. No press vehicles gathered beyond the gates. No unusual guard formation signaled disruption. The palace facade remained unchanged, stone steady, windows reflective, flags moving gently against the pale sky. Yet inside, the air carried quiet consequence. The consultant arrived precisely on time. He was escorted not through grand ceremonial corridors, but through a side entrance reserved for discreet proceedings. No handcuffs, no raised voices, only measured footsteps against marble. Professional, controlled. Prince William waited in a private chamber governed under confidentiality, statutes older than any present in the room. Legal counsel stood at a distance. The head of royal protection remained silent near the door. Camilla was not present. This confrontation would not be personal. It would be institutional. The consultant entered with composure intact. His posture was upright, expression calm, eyes attentive. If he felt anxiety, it did not surface. "Your Royal Highness," he said respectfully, offering a slight bow. William acknowledged him with a nod. No pleasantries followed. On the table between them lay a single secure tablet and a sealed envelope. William spoke first. A device was discovered within Clarence House. The consultant did not interrupt. It recorded 2 private strategy sessions. Stillness. William activated the tablet. A waveform appeared, visual proof of captured sound. Time-stamped. Verified. Metadata followed. Encrypted firmware signature analysis. A subtle but undeniable link to configuration patterns unique to the consultant's proprietary advisory tools. Not direct authorship, but intellectual fingerprint. The consultant's composure shifted almost imperceptibly. Not collapse, not panic, recognition. "You believe I designed it," he said evenly. "We know you configured it," William replied. Silence settled between them. The consultant inhaled slowly. "I did not leak anything," he said. "That is not the standard," William answered calmly. "The standard is breach." The distinction was critical. Leakage implies damage. Breach implies violation. And violation of closed counsel was a line the monarchy could not allow to blur. The consultant's gaze sharpened slightly. "I serve this institution," he said. "I push for modernization when hesitation endangered relevance." William did not raise his voice. Advising reform does not grant authority to surveil counsel. The words were precise. No accusation beyond fact. No dramatics. Just clarity. The consultant's restraint faltered for the first time, not emotionally, but ideologically. "You deliberate for months while narratives form in hours," he said quietly. "You debate optics while public trust shifts in real time." I sought preparedness. Preparedness, a noble word, but weaponized here as justification. William folded his hands on the table. "The crown adapts deliberately," he said, "not reactively. Influence without consent is intrusion." The consultant held his gaze. "You dismiss me for urgency," he said, "for refusing to accept inertia." William allowed a beat of silence before responding. "You were dismissed for overreach." The room felt smaller now, not physically, philosophically. The consultant looked toward the sealed envelope. "What are my options?" he asked. There it was, the shift from defense to consequence. William opened the envelope and slid a document forward. A formal institutional censure under confidentiality statutes. Permanent exclusion from advisory roles tied to royal operations. Non-disclosure reinforcement clauses. And a final provision. Legal escalation under breach of trust law if resistance occurred. No public naming. No scandal. No press exposure. The monarchy would not feed spectacle, but it would close the door permanently. "You may sign," William said evenly, "and this matter remains sealed." "And if I decline?" William met his eyes. "Then it proceeds through legal channels." The consultant understood immediately what that meant. Public inquiry, exposure, permanent professional destruction, and perhaps worse, the narrative would not be his to shape. He leaned back slightly. "You would suppress it entirely?" William's response was measured. "We will contain it." Containment, not suppression, not denial. Reform had already begun internally. Security protocols recalibrated, access privileges restructured, but externally silence would prevail. The consultant studied the document for several long moments. Then, without further argument, he signed. The pen's movement across paper sounded louder than expected. Final. Security collected the document. No handshake followed. No dramatic dismissal. Only procedure. As he was escorted out, the consultant paused briefly. "You cannot insulate forever," he said quietly. William's answer was calm. "Insulation is not our aim. Integrity is." The door closed, and with it, a chapter ended. But resolution rarely feels triumphant inside institutions built on continuity. It feels quiet, measured, necessary. Later that afternoon, a private audience convened with senior family members and security leadership. William presented findings without embellishment, facts, evidence, resolution. Camilla listened without interruption. When he concluded, she nodded once. "Then we proceed," she said, and proceed they did. The junior aide who had unknowingly facilitated archival access was granted institutional clemency under manipulated compliance provisions. Additional training mandated. Career intact. The message was clear. The monarchy punishes intent. It educates error. Security leadership implemented silent reforms. Dual authentication for archival retrieval, rotating clearance audits, compartmentalized advisory access. No announcement. No press release, but internal equilibrium restored. That evening, Camilla resumed her scheduled public engagement, a hospital visit. She walked through corridors lined with staff and patients offering smiles and flowers. No one outside those palace walls knew what had nearly unfolded. No one sensed the quiet crisis that had threatened to distort counsel. And that was intentional. The crown does not display every fracture. It reinforces from within. William observed the engagement from a discreet distance. Camilla's composure was unwavering. Years of scrutiny had taught her something invaluable. Public life demands endurance beyond explanation. She spoke warmly with patience. She listened. She smiled. The weight of the previous days remained invisible beneath protocol. That invisibility was not deception. It was discipline. Back at Clarence House, as evening settled once more, the corridors felt different. Not lighter, but steadier. The whisper had been addressed, not amplified. William stood in his office, overlooking the courtyard. Guards rotated with mechanical precision below. Boots against gravel. Measured cadence. Continuity. He reflected on the narrow margin between exposure and containment. The public often equates transparency with strength. But institutions built on continuity understand something deeper. Some truths, if exposed recklessly, fracture more than they heal. This was not about protecting pride. It was about protecting stability. Had the recording surfaced publicly, headlines would have focused not on content, but breach. Speculation would eclipse context. Confidence would erode. Instead, reform occurred silently. Trust restructured carefully. Authority reaffirmed without spectacle. Camilla joined him briefly. The two stood without speaking for a moment. "Was it enough?" she asked softly. William considered. "For now," he said, "because stability is not permanent. It is maintained." She nodded. Years of experience had taught her that crises rarely end with drama. They end with discipline. As night deepened, the palace returned to its familiar rhythm. Staff departed quietly. Security rotations adjusted seamlessly. No visible scar remained. But William understood something had shifted internally. The line between loyalty and ambition had been clarified, boundaries redefined. The monarchy had chosen silence over spectacle, containment over confrontation, integrity over exposure. Yet he also understood this. Silence is powerful, but it is not invincible. He looked once more toward the stone facade illuminated by soft lights. The crown had endured because it absorbed shocks without shattering, because it chose dignity over drama, because it remembered that leadership is not vindication. It is restraint. And as calm sailed across the palace once more, William felt the invisible weight of something few would ever understand. Some victories are measured not by applause, but by the absence of chaos. The archive room had fallen silent again, its documents returned to order, its shadows undisturbed. Yet the decision forged within its walls now moved toward consequence. Morning arrived without ceremony. Clarence House stood as it always had. Stone unmoved, guards disciplined, gates controlled with quiet precision. To the public eye, nothing had shifted, but within, a private reckoning prepared to unfold. The consultant was received through a restricted entrance reserved for confidential proceedings. No insignia marked the moment. No press cameras lingered beyond the gates. The monarchy does not announce its internal corrections. It enacts them. Prince William waited in a council chamber stripped of decoration beyond necessity. No portraits, no tapestries, only a long polished table and control light filtering through drawn curtains. Legal counsel stood at measured distance. The head of Royal Protection Command remained near the door, silent, observant. When consultant entered, he carried himself with professional composure, his suit immaculate, his posture steady. But behind the stillness of his expression lay calculation. "Your Royal Highness," he greeted formally. William inclined his head once. There would be no preamble. "A recording device was discovered within Clarence House," William began, voice calm and evenly paced. "It captured 2 confidential strategy sessions." The consultant did not interrupt. His eyes remained focused. William activated the secure tablet before him. A waveform illuminated the screen. Time-stamped, authenticated, irrefutable. Metadata followed. Firmware coding patterns. Configuration architecture, matching proprietary systems previously designed by the consultant during his tenure. Not a fingerprint visible to the untrained eye, but unmistakable to forensic analysis. "You were not dismissed for incompetence," William continued. "You were dismissed for exceeding advisory boundaries." A subtle shift in the consultant's jaw betrayed recognition. "I did not leak the recordings," he replied quietly. William's gaze did not waver. "That is not the standard by which this is judged." A pause. "The standard is trust." Silence settled heavily between them. The consultant leaned back slightly, fingers interlacing. "I believe the institution was vulnerable to stagnation," he said. "I sought awareness, preparation." "By surveillance?" William asked, not sharply but with clarity. The consultant hesitated. "Only briefly. By ensuring I understood internal positioning should instability arise." There it was. Not sabotage, contingency. Leverage prepared for a moment of fracture. William folded his hands. "The Crown does not function through contingency leverage," he said evenly. "It functions through discipline counsel. You cross that boundary." The consultant's composure thinned, not emotionally, but ideologically. "You deliberate while narratives move," he insisted. "Influence shifts hourly in the modern world." "And restraint," William replied calmly, "is precisely why the institution endures beyond hourly shifts." The room seemed to contract around that truth. William opened a sealed envelope and placed a document on the table. A formal censure under internal confidentiality statutes. Permanent revocation of access. Lifetime exclusion from royal advisory roles. Reinforced non-disclosure obligations. No public statement. No press naming. No spectacle. If signed, the matter would remain sealed. If refused, legal escalation under breach of trust law would proceed. Publicly, the consultant studied the document carefully. "You would keep this hidden?" he asked. "We will contain it," William answered. Containment was not concealment. Internal reforms were already underway. Security protocols strengthened. Archival access recalibrated. Advisory frameworks clarified. But public exposure would not strengthen the institution. It would weaken it. The consultant exhaled slowly. "You fear transparency," he said. William's expression remained composed. "We fear destabilization born of spectacle." The distinction mattered. After several long seconds, the consultant signed. The sound of pen against paper was soft, but decisive. No triumph filled the room, only closure. As security escorted him out through the same discreet corridor, he paused briefly at the doorway. "You cannot modernize in silence forever," he said quietly. William's reply was measured. "We modernize deliberately." The door closed, and with it, ambition severed from access. That afternoon, a private audience convened with senior family members and security leadership. The findings were presented with precision and restraint. No dramatics, no moral lectures, just facts. Camilla listened attentively, hands folded, expression composed. When William concluded, she spoke only once. Then the matter is resolved. Resolved, not erased. Internal reforms were formalized immediately. Dual authentication for sensitive archival retrieval, revised advisory clearance parameters, rotational oversight audits within Royal Protection Command. The junior aide who had unknowingly facilitated archival access was granted clemency under manipulated compliance doctrine. Additional training mandated. Career preserved. The monarchy disciplines intent. It educates error. That evening, Camilla attended a scheduled public engagement at a London medical center. She walked through the hospital corridors with steady grace, greeting staff, accepting bouquets, listening to stories of recovery and endurance. No flicker of recent tension surfaced in her expression, because resilience, for those who serve publicly, is not performance. It is necessity. Observers saw composure. They did not see the archive room. They did not hear the confrontation. They did not feel the narrow margin between fracture and containment, and that invisibility was deliberate. Back at Clarence House, William stood at his office window as twilight settled over the courtyard. Guards rotated with precise timing. Gravel shifted beneath polished boots. Continuity restored. Yet leadership does not measure success by absence of noise alone. It measures stability preserved. He reflected on the choice he had made, to contain rather than expose, to correct without spectacle, to reinforce rather than retaliate. Public accountability has power, but so does institutional discipline exercise without applause. Camilla joined him briefly. The whisper fades, she said softly. For now, William replied, because silence requires vigilance. The crown had chosen dignity over drama, containment over confrontation, integrity over vindication. But the experience left an imprint, a reminder that erosion rarely announces itself loudly. It begins with proximity, with conviction untethered from restraint. As night deepened and palace lights dimmed one by one, William understood the invisible burden of command more clearly than ever. Some crises are prevented before the world ever learns they existed. Some battles are won without declaration. And sometimes the greatest strength of the crown is not its visibility, but its discipline to rise above the whisper. The courtyard was quiet again. Morning light stretched across stone walls that had endured centuries of storms, political, personal, historical. Guards moved in steady rhythm, their measured cadence echoing softly against gravel. To an outsider, the palace appeared untouched. But institutions are rarely shaped by what the public sees. They are shaped by what they choose not to reveal. In the days following the private inquiry, Clarence House returned to its disciplined equilibrium. Meetings resumed. Advisory briefings continued. Public engagements unfolded with practiced grace. The machinery of monarchy, ceremonial yet deeply strategic, moved forward without interruption. Yet something had settled beneath the surface. Not fear, awareness. Prince William stood alone in a narrow gallery lined with portraits of sovereigns past. Each frame captured authority in stillness. Faces composed, gazes resolute. History does not remember every threat. It remembers endurance. He reflected not on the device itself, but on the interruption, the moment he entered that strategy meeting unannounced, the stillness that followed, the realization that trust, so carefully layered over time, can be tested in silence. The breach had not been explosive. There were no sirens, no public scandal, no parliamentary outrage, and yet it had carried weight, because it challenged something deeper than security. It challenged integrity. The monarchy survives not because it is flawless, but because it understands restraint. It recognizes that power exercised without discipline corrodes from within. William understood now that his interruption had never truly been about a device hidden in a handbag. It had been about preserving the boundary between influence and intrusion, between advice and authority, between ambition and duty. Silence in this context was not avoidance. It was sovereignty. Camilla moved through her engagements with the same steady composure that had defined decades of public service. Her resilience was not theatrical. It was practiced in private. She had said little more about the incident, not because it was forgotten, but because dwelling on it would give it weight beyond its rightful place. There is a particular burden carried by those who live within perpetual observation, every gesture analyzed, every silence interpreted, and yet the greatest strength of public life often lies in what is withheld. Camilla understood that responding loudly would invite amplification. Responding quietly would starve it. The consultant's name would not surface in headlines. The junior aide would not become a cautionary tale. The reforms would remain internal. And that choice was deliberate, for the Crown does not perform its corrections. It implements them. Meanwhile, within the Royal Protection Command, protocols had shifted subtly but permanently. Clearance systems recalibrated. Advisory access narrowed with precision. Archival retrieval now required layered verification. Not announced, just enforced. Because vigilance is most effective when it is routine. One afternoon, William walked the perimeter gardens, gravel crunching beneath his shoes. The air was cool, the trees bare against the pale sky. He considered the paradox of modern monarchy. It must remain visible enough to inspire trust, yet restrained enough to resist reactionary impulse. Too much transparency invites instability. Too much secrecy invites suspicion. Balance is not static. It is maintained. The breach had revealed a truth older than any single generation. Institutions are rarely threatened by loud enemies alone. They are threatened by quiet erosion, by proximity without discipline, by influence untethered from consent. He paused near the outer gates, watching as a small group of visitors gathered beyond the ironwork. Cameras raised, faces hopeful. To them, the monarchy represented continuity, tradition, stability in uncertain times. They would never know how close internal trust had come to strain, and perhaps they never should, because leadership is not about displaying vulnerability at every turn. It is about managing it responsibly. Inside the palace, life resumed its ceremonial cadence. Invitations drafted, diplomatic briefings reviewed, charitable patronages scheduled months in advance. Continuity is not accidental. It is constructed and maintained through disciplined restraint. In a quiet study one evening, William reviewed correspondence by lamplight. The incident report lay sealed in a secure drawer, not erased, not forgotten, recorded, because history, even when silent, is preserved. He understood something more clearly now. Silence is not weakness. It is control. Outrage can be satisfying. Exposure can feel righteous. But neither guarantees stability. The Crown had endured because it understood proportion, because it responded without panic, because it recognized that dignity is often the most strategic answer. Camilla joined him briefly. They spoke not of the device, but of upcoming engagements, of community initiatives, of long-term strategy, forward motion, that, more than any statement, signaled recovery. Before leaving, she paused. "You did what was necessary," she said quietly. William considered her words. Necessary decisions rarely feel triumphant. They feel heavy. But they preserve something greater than personal vindication. They preserve continuity. That night, the palace lights dimmed gradually, one window at a time. The courtyard settled into stillness once more. The whisper had faded. The breach contained. But the lesson endured. The monarchy does not survive because conflict never arises. It survives because duty prevails over ego, because loyalty outweighs ambition, because silence, when chosen deliberately, can be stronger than declaration. In the years ahead, there would be other challenges, new debates, fresh tensions between tradition and modernity. There always are, but this moment will remain a quiet reminder within William's leadership. Power is not defended through noise. It is safeguarded through discipline. The interruption that began this chapter of crisis had not shaken the Crown beyond repair. It had tested it, and in that testing, reaffirmed its core principle. Sovereignty is not dominance. It is restraint exercised with clarity. As dawn approached once more, and the first guards of the morning took their posts, William looked across the courtyard with steady composure. The institution remained intact, not because it was impervious, but because it understood when to speak and when silence itself is authority.